Wow, what a turnout here tonight. I'm glad that you all were able to make it. This is a project that I've taken on, as you've heard, is a retirement project. And it's turned out into almost like a second career. And so much has changed that we used to go to the library and read books and do research there. And when we were in school, we'd spend a lot of time digging through the library to find information. And everything's changed with the internet and the web. And I found things that would have been impossible to locate in the past. They're out there somewhere buried on the web. And what's more, it's provided a way to share what you find. In the past, you might write a book about your work or an article, and it'd be read by a few people. This project has taken on kind of a life of its own through the website and the videos that I put together as part of the project and shared through YouTube. So it's truly a changed world at being able to share things that are your experience and allow others to come into the world, at least on a virtual level, through the website and the videos. And hopefully we can encourage more people to get out and walk and explore and be part of their communities and looking at the heritage that is right here in Tolland and in the communities surrounding here. Now, I have a program guide here so that you'll have some idea that I'm going to do a couple of things and then bring Tim Gaudier in to talk about some of the work that he's doing here in Tolland. That I've been looking at how to reconnect the Old Connecticut Path. There have been pieces that have been known over time, but how it all fit together has been left to someone who'd be willing to charge right in, and being the fool that I am, I took on the challenge. And along the way, I've found certain places that are pearls, that I call pearls, that are really special places. And there's some right here in Tolland, and I've learned to say Tolland correctly, as part of the project. And also I've learned more about the story that goes behind the places that I found along the path. So I'll kind of cover those and then bring Tim Gaudier, who's a Tolland resident and has really dug into the western part of town and looking at the old ways that the settlers going down to Windsor and Hartford and on to Wethersfield traveled, and also that were important in the early settlement of Tolland. And it's fascinating work, and I call it treasure hunting, because really if you want to have a chance to go out and explore and find a treasure, you don't have to travel too far. Tim's going to show you some places that you may be able to look. And then bring it back around to your questions and really look at some future directions on this project. And as you've heard, I created a website. If you go on Google, whoever thought, just go on Google, type Old Connecticut Path, and you'll find the listing. You'll find the listing right there for Old Connecticut Path. It used to be that there was virtually nothing there, and now it's all about me. There's a me. If you click on videos, you'll see there's a whole slew of videos. But I encourage you to go through the website because it helps to give a structure to the videos so that you know what order they are and by location, and some of the background materials that go with it. Now you've heard that I'm a descendant of Thomas Hooker, and growing up I didn't really know what that meant. It's probably a good thing for me to discover it after I've had a chance to hopefully mature a little bit. But my real interest in starting this was that my two ancestors that came together here were Roger Newton, who was a minister, came down to study in the home of Thomas Hooker and Susanna Hooker to prepare for the ministry, and wound up marrying Mary Hooker. And we think probably there was a little bit going on before he arrived from that school up the road that used to be called Cambridge, and they changed the name. But their family and my descendants directly through them were first arrivals here. And in doing the project, I found out that I was connected to a whole bunch of other families. And as I've said, going down to Windsor and Hartford, and even to Wethersfield, the three founding towns. The founding families, I found that if you go back far enough, you're related to everyone. And it didn't take going back too far to wind up being related to everyone, and I'm sure that there were a whole bunch others. And they had lots of children, and they wound up being related, so it gets very interesting if you start digging back into your family history. So in setting out to do this project, there were a couple of questions I was trying to answer, because no one really was able to say, other than a few locations along the way, is that can we put together a connected route from Cambridge to Hartford? And after all the changes that have occurred over 375 years, are there still places that you can go that are wild, that you have that sense of maybe a little bit, we can't duplicate the world as it was, but might give you a flavor of what that world was like as though they traveled through it? And then are there things that you could look at that would be artifacts that would show the passage of travelers along the path and those who settled along the path later? And I didn't realize the big challenge I was taking on in doing this, but some of the things I had to consider in reconstructing it is that there really wasn't one path. There were thousands of Indian paths. They didn't know how to put them all together in a way that you could get from one place to another, and we're trying to put that back together. But there might be several ways to get from one place to another, and if it was a stormy fall, and you had tropical storms and had high waters in the rivers, you might go one way, or if the snow was deeper, you might go another way. But they all would run in parallel. And that there were great changes after King Philip's War in settlement here in eastern Connecticut. Prior to that time, it was native lands. And the settlement here, and we start seeing the 300th anniversary of many of the towns, really occurred after the King Philip's War. And we had to go back and dig through and find old maps, and really there weren't many maps going back to the earliest years, and that's where oral history seemed to be so important in passing down, that families passed down the stories of the places of their land that the Hooker party and others traveled through. And those seem to be quite powerful, and they were passed down, and I'm still hearing from folks as I have these meetings and talk with people in different towns about land that they own or they grew up on, that they'd heard the stories of years ago. And I had to look and see if we could put it together in a coherent route. There are a lot of places, as I said, that there's lore about, but if you tie them all together, some of them might pull you off on a track that wouldn't be terribly logical or direct. And we really needed to look at preserving some of the history and the traditions of the towns along the way, because places I know like over in Woodstock are very involved in it, and it's an important part of their town and their tradition and their history. And I do think that I have found a likely corridor, but I say likely in that there's variations. So what you'll see with me, I'll say, you know, there's no absolute proof, and but it's as good as I think I can get it to give us an idea of some of the land that they traveled through and some of the things you might have seen. And a big problem that I hope to avoid is what I call minefields. And in the past, there was efforts to line up the path, and there were some differences of opinions. And it got kind of heated, and some cases it got a little nasty. And you read some of the letters that went back and forth, and you say, gosh, it's like when you're really close to something and you wind up in an argument with someone else, and you find out later that you were arguing about something but you basically agreed. Well, I'm looking at things 60, 80 years later, and I'm saying, well, gee, they really were agreeing, they just didn't know it. But to really try and avoid some of the minefields and doing the project. Now, the easy part of the whole project was that there were a lot of signs out there pointing the way, especially interestingly coming across Massachusetts. You could follow a trail of Thomas Hooker was here, or the Old Connecticut Path crossed over this hill. roads named after them that are right on the path, and markers along the way here in Connecticut too. So there is some sense of history connecting from Cambridge all the way on down to Hartford. And filling in the gaps in between has been the real challenge that we've undertaken here. And one of the first people who took on this task about 70, 80 years ago was Harold Ayers. And he defined a route that he wound up doing some modifications on, but a route that pointed away following the praying villages that were established by John Eliot. He's giving a course down to Woodstock, and then across the hills in Windham County, down here to Tolland, and on down to Hartford. And he later changed his mind. He originally stated, well, we'll go through over to Windsor and then down. And as a result of some discussion and feedback that he'd gotten, he realized that constructively what he was given was there would be a way that would be very rational to follow the river on down to Tankerhoos and the Hocking rivers right on down to Hartford. So he did acknowledge and make a change in his mind and his route. But there were a lot of gaps. And as I got into this, there was much more that he didn't touch on than what he did. So using a lot of maps and oral history and town histories to try and identify what was the potential route or the best possible route that we can look at today and say this would fit. And I had to try to do some things to understand from the minds of those pioneers that they need a way of traveling that was safe, direct, and we have to remember that they were walking. There were no roads, so it had to be a way that you could walk easily. And there were no Motel 6s or any conveniences along the way, so they need to have places that were good for resting and really places that they could have trade with the natives. That the natives at that time, the Indians along the way, were not hostile to the settlers coming down through. That occurred much later, and that's a whole other story to get into beyond what we do tonight. But they generally were accepting and helpful, and probably in 2020 in hindsight, they'd say, gee, we probably would have been better off letting them get lost in the woods rather than trying to help them. And there were some other considerations that as you go back and look at, like climate. It was a much colder climate. They had what they called a mini ice age going on at that time. We have global warming. They had serious global cooling. So seasons were shorter, snow was deeper, and summers, some years they didn't have a summer. So out of all this, with much walking, you see little pin drops here from my GPS spread out, going from West Sutton, Mass, on down to Tolland. So we cross over Sutton, Douglas, Webster, Dudley, Thompson, Woodstock. Let's see if I can do this. Eastford, Ashford, Willington, and on to Tolland. And you can't see here, there are probably about 2,000 or 3,000 other droppings of dots along the way, because to find what I was looking for took a lot more walking in the woods, going back and forth. But it really was an adventure. We think that the world has been totally paved over and lost, and it's surprising the level of the wilderness that's there, and that there's a connection that you can find if you're willing to go out there to look. So for a few moments, I'm going to take you with me for a little walk from West Sutton and Waters Farm. If you want to go and have a lovely day, go to Manchog Pond and Waters Farm in West Sutton, which was a place where the Manchog Prairie Village would have been located in that area. And then we enter a 3-mile walk across the Douglas Woods. And it's total wilderness. There's no other access roads crossing. And you pass woodland with beaver ponds and stone constructions of old cabins and lodgings along the way. And you get a real sense of immersing into a wilderness. And there are times when you're in there that it's so quiet that all you can hear is the wind in the trees. And keep in mind, this is about 30 minutes outside of Worcester, so in a 30-minute time, you can be in the woods walking down the hill towards Webster Lake, and I won't even try to say it in the long form. I did it on a tape that I'm still waiting to get done. And we come across to Dudley, and we find little stone formations that have been left by the early settlers, and wildlife along the way. It's just truly a wonderland. Now, crossing into Thompson, Ellen Larned showed the way in 1874 in her map of ancient Windsor County. And you can find the way down to the Quinnebog River fording place and up through the Thompson Woods, which is another 3 miles of wilderness walking between the Quinnebog River and on up to Woodstock. Now, Woodstock is a beautiful place. I mean, Woodstock is like going to another country, and it actually looks like England. They've done a remarkable job in Woodstock of identifying the path through their town and having it registered as in the National Register of Historic Places. You can see on one of their guided walks, which if you get a chance, please do go. You can walk along a portion of the Old Connecticut Path. And leading into the wilderness up Rocky Hill Road and the wilderness over to Crystal Pond. So you're entering a world here as we cross Crystal Pond and the streams along the way that leads us into a woodland where from West Sutton up to Crystal Pond, I would say I've spent about 80% of the time in woods along a route that can be defined using the old maps, linking up with the places that have been identified by tradition. And along the way, we get through Eastford, and I'm going to stop right here for a moment, because one of the things to share with you is an artifact, and you don't think too much about it, but I'm going to, because the laser doesn't work here, I guess, is there's a stone, a Bigelow Brook. It's called a brook, but if you go on out there, and I encourage you to, because it's one of the pearls along the way, the Bigelow Brook is really a river. And on the old maps, it says river. And if you go there at the wrong time, you wouldn't want to step into it because it's a river. But in the lore of the Connecticut Path, Charles Chisholm described a memory that he had of walking to school in the 1870s, 1875 with his brother. And they lived up the road a little way on Pine Hill, which you'll hear about in a moment. They came down the hill on the road. They had to cross the Bigelow Brook, or river, and there was a bridge for them to go across the river and uphill to the school, one-room schoolhouse that they went to at that time. But he said, about 60 feet above the bridge, there were a series of these great stones, and they'd be about this big, placed across the brook. The tradition had that they were placed there along the path followed by Thomas Hooker. When you think about crossings and low technology, stone was readily available. And here's one of the remaining pieces. And Harold Ayers went out with Chisholm in about 1935, and they went down. So Ayers wrote about walking across it. And Ayers went back after the 1938 hurricane, 1939. And the great flood of water that came down through knocked out several of the stones. So this is the one that's remaining. The others are probably buried and flipped down the stream. But this is one of the pearls, and if you go on the website, there's a walk along Walker Road, which is open, and you can go in, and it's a stunning place to walk. I gotta move on here. So there are pearls along the way, like this, that you can get into the woods and walk to places that are along the Connecticut Path. And that leads me down here, you know, you're all here, I used to say Tolland. You know, I come down the Mass Pike on the Toll Road, and then I got very politely corrected, no, it's not Tolland, it's Tolland. Going back to the Old English. And so I try very hard to control myself. But the path comes down out of across Willington down to the place, if you go down, right down Route 74 to Home, and right in that area seems to be about where the fording place would be on the Willimantic River. And I had to go looking for clues that might tell me, okay, where would the path be? We can go and say, well, just drive up Route 74, which some have done. Folks over in Windsor, in their reenactment of the walk from Dorchester to Windsor, they walked right up Route 74. They do it again for the 400. I think they'll find that there's a nice place that they can go off the road that's quite beautiful. But looking at the old maps, there was a survey by Nathaniel Woodward, another one of my ancestors, and Solomon Safri. They came through in 1642. And they actually took measurements. Their measurements caused some controversy. 175 years of controversy between Massachusetts and Connecticut over where the boundary was. But what they did was that they also took measures of latitude to show about where they were. And 4152 north latitude. And when I went to look on my computer mapping system, right about here is 4152. So in 1642, they traveled through here on their way to Windsor. So that gives us one clue that there was a trail even at that time, which would be 6 years after Thomas Hooker and the congregation came through. And looking at the Peterson maps, it really didn't show anything other than roads that are existing. But Connecticut has a wonderful archive of aerial photographs from going back to 1934. And they're very fine, detailed photographs. And when I put them together, and you look very closely, and I put a line on here, there's actually a road hidden in there that doesn't show up on the other maps. And it did show up, part of it showed up on the topographic maps, the Geological Service maps. But looking at this and piecing it together with that early map of the Peterson map from 1850, it would have run right across almost in parallel with Route 74. And where this jog is in the road was where they changed direction on it. And Buff Cap would have extended a little further down. But to take you down at the ground level so that you get a chance to see, if you were to go out there, here's some of the things you might see. Well, if you go into Holman right there after you cross the bridge on Route 74, you can step right down to the banks of the Willimantic, and you'll see one shot with leaves and one without the leaves, that the river itself is wide, the banks come down low, and it's shallow. As I understand it, I think I've figured this out, that if I really wanted to avoid a lot of difficult travel, I could consult the fly fishermen on where they go, and it probably would work out being pretty good places to cross, because this would be prime fly fisherman's paradise here along this portion of the river. As you walk up the line through the park, up near the top of the hill on Peril Road, there's this subtle grade that branches off into nothingness. And because there's private land beyond, this is a satellite photo. I didn't climb up a tree or anything. When they put the road, Route 74 in, they cut a deep trench. So the road was cut. And that ancient road actually goes right through that property along the line of Holman Forest. And here's what it looks like. It's a beautifully preserved roadway that's virtually been forgotten. And as we climb up the hill, it does do a curve to cut the grade going up the hill beyond Grapevine Brook up to Route 84. So all of you have ridden on Route 84, and you can now say, yes, you've been on the Old Connecticut Path, at least for a fraction of a second you passed over. And crossing on the west side in Holman State Forest, it leads uphill on a well-defined roadway, coming out of the woods, right at the Connecticut State Police Barracks. And looking at the alignment of this I'm sure they didn't do this purposely. Their barracks is probably sitting right dead smack in this roadway that is likely the route of the path. And continuing on the west side, it goes on towards Evergreen Drive, and if there's any folks here who know the area around Amy Drive, okay, all right. Your backyard, going to Nye Holman, that boundary is likely the course of the road. If you go in there and you look carefully, you'll see a depression. It's filled in over the course of time. There is a line leading right up towards Evergreen. And that's something that when the roads are no longer in use, they wind up becoming property lines when they're abandoned. And crossing over on the west side, there's a land that I learned about from Roseanne Gaudier. She's shared with me the story of Madeline Regan, who's a Tolland resident, who walked on a path through her woods and related the story of her mother and grandmother traveling along this path all the way down to the Willimantic River, and they gathered nuts and flowers along the path. And she had a survey done in 1974, and the surveyor said, "Did you know this is the old path?" So she'd hoped that this would be preserved, and I understand that there may be some ways of it being preserved for the future. So there is a section that, as we look, is a pearl going from Nye Holman, largely through Nye Holman State Forest or next to it, up to the Tolland Stage Road, just short of the Scumbernaut River. And my best guess, given they like to get there directly, would be it's likely to carry on up over Torrey Road here to Tolland. So we have something there, and you've heard that Tim Gaudier is going to speak. Tim's been doing work to the west to look at the connecting paths that lead from there. And I'm thinking in terms of the ways that we have a record of the path to Windsor branching off west of Hawk Hill, probably near Painit's Pond, going down to the north end of the lake. And the sense of the travel line down the Tankerhoosen and the Hockenham River to Hartford, and a branching for those going on to Wethersfield. Because they all, each of them I found, they have ferry places that they can identify going across. So those are the things that are in the future here. But I really, as I got into this, it's more than just a story about here are places you can go and pictures of artifacts in the road. It's a story about people. And that was my attraction in starting down this, and as one of my things is I'm also a psychologist, and as a psychologist working in the schools, you try to think of things as, well, gee, what was this experience like for the people who were traveling? And wouldn't you love to be able to find out what that story was? And I have to be creative because the story is one that I don't know that anyone's really telling, so maybe with a little historical fiction or fictional historian work here, I can try and fill in at least what I've learned. And the big thing I learned, or was confronted with, is that I have this giant, big black hole about colonial history. Because when we were all in school, we all learned every year about the Pilgrims. And there was a whole lot of yucky stuff that happened afterwards, and then it was Lexington and Concord. Am I right? You laugh, and I think that we all kind of go, yeah, maybe that other yucky stuff we figure out later on in life might have not been so lucky, but there was about 150 years there where we had this big black hole. And so I had to try and kind of figure out how do you fill that in. And central to the big hole, one of the key characters was our friend Thomas Hooker. And it's kind of daunting when you get in there and you see he's standing downtown, and he's standing up there on the state capitol, literally a monumental figure in that time and recognized still. So it's hard psychologically to get into that, of who he was and what was going on in his mind. You know, he has all these things. He was, without all the other things that happened, he was a scholar that was well published and recognized for, and is still read for his theological work, and minister, reformer, and founder. Is like he was busy founding a lot of things, or being part of a lot of things beginning, like in Hartford, Connecticut, the New England Confederation, which I learned about. The colonies got together and tried to figure out how to work together. Statesman who was called upon to help resolve problems and difficulties that arose between colonies and in the colonies. And some would say father of American democracy, which you kind of say, how do you get into the mind of a person like that? And so the challenge of getting into his mind was trying to think what would really bring him down a peg. Bring him down to his knees so that we might get a sense of more who he is at a human level. And the answer quite simply came to me, children. If there's anything that can bring you down to your knees, it would be having 5 children, he and Susanna, his wife, and traveling from England across from Cambridge down to Hartford. And you can just imagine the kind of questions, we know the kinds of questions kids ask, and having that long journey to endure those questions like, why? We all have those why questions, why because, why, and we try to, and then there's, as the kids get a little older, there's the, do we have to? And then, you know, for those of us who've traveled, you know, we've all traveled with children, you can imagine the number of times they had to deal with, are we almost there yet? You think about crossing the ocean and coming across the wilderness, the children would give us an insight into that time and that travel. And so borrowing on the family, Mary Hooker's my ancestor. And she would have had unique insight into the story of this trip, because she was about 12 years old when they walked from Cambridge on down to Hartford. So she's old enough to be able to remember things. And she would be old enough to remember what was like back in England before they came over. And so with a little historical interpretation, I'm going to try and tell it a little bit from the perspective of Mary coming along the path and along this journey. And she was qualified also because she walked all the way, and our family story is that she walked beside her mother, who was carried. And some said Susanna was an invalid, but if you look at the fact that she had a 6-year-old, a 5-year-old, and a not quite 3-year-old child, she was pretty busy. And Mary's job was to walk along beside her mother and help with the children. So Mary went on, she and Roger Newton, they went on and they had 8 children. So on a night like this, without the lights, without the heat, it's probably bringing back memories of last fall's storms to some of you folks. You can imagine the stories that might have been told around the fire. Tell us a story. So let's try and tell a little bit of the story with some pictures from Mary coming across. But she'd say, there was a time when we were in England, and Father was the lecturer of the church in Chelmsford, in St. Mary's Church. And he was an important person in shaping the town, because it was a trade town, a center of trade, and it was a drinking town. And the drunkenness was getting out of hand, and Father had powerful influence on the town and beginning to bring that under control. And he was recognized by the people there and by the other ministers as a leader. And during that time, we lived in a warm house not far out of Chelmsford called the Cuckoo's Farm, a little beta. And in that time, we lived together on the farm. John Elliott came to live in our home as Father's assistant. And they opened a school there at Little Beta. And this was a place where They opened a school there at Toledo, and this was a place of great happiness in that life, as we could imagine. A young girl, about 6 or 7 years old, on the farm. But it was a time of trouble in England, and there was a storm brewing. And part of the storm brewing was King Charles pronounced that there was only one way that the church leaders could act, and any deviation was not acceptable. The other challenge was William Laud. When Laud came, there was greater trouble for Father in England. When he became Bishop of London, he sought to, as the king's advisor, to cleanse the ministry. And he took a list and wrote down next to each minister, O for Orthodox and P for Puritan. And then went about with his spies and his secret police, persuading the Puritans to change their ways or be jailed. And shortly after Laud came to power, Father was removed from his position in the church in Chelmsford and silenced. But it didn't really silence him, because ministers from miles around kept coming to meet with him at our farm, at the Cuckoo's Farm. And it came to the attention of Laud that Father wasn't silenced. And so Laud sent a warrant for Father to appear in his court. 49 ministers wrote to Laud to petition him to release Father from these charges. But Laud wouldn't have anything from it. He sent troops out, he sent police out to arrest Father. So Father had to go into hiding, and he went to Towcester. And in the home of Samuel Stone, he was given shelter. And the secret police came and banged on Reverend Stone's door to seek to arrest him. And Samuel said, "I saw him an hour ago, over there. If you go quick, you might be able to catch him." And of course, Father put on his cape and went out the back door and had to begin his exile to Holland. And he had to stay away because he was sought by Laud and his police and his spies. And it wasn't until 1633 that we were really reunited as a family. In 1633, Laud became the Archbishop of Canterbury. And so he was the supreme bishop. And all who held to the Puritan belief knew that they would not be able to change the church and the country within. They had to leave to go to a New England. So they sailed for 2 months on the Griffin. From June to September, we sailed across. 200 people on a ship, crammed below decks for 2 months. And when we arrived, shortly after, Mother gave birth to Samuel. We don't know how, I don't know how, as Mary might say, I don't know how Mother could have endured being with child for 2 months below deck, coming across the Atlantic. But we were home in Newtown, and we had a comfortable home, and it felt like things were settling again. But already Father was planning for us to continue on with our congregation to come to Connecticut. And so, in 1636, we met on the Common in Cambridge. Across from that school, we now call Hartford, but for us then it was called Cambridge. And we began our journey west across the Connecticut. And we walked along the way, and some would say we drank milk all the way, but that's not really serious. Most of the milk was spilled on the ground. But we were able to trade with the natives for food And we carried our food, some of our food and belongings with us. And going on foot through the wilderness, we could travel with the cows following about 10 miles a day. And they were long days because there weren't roads. They were following the path. Now, we might have gotten lost along the way because there were so many paths that we saw breaking off. But the Indian guides knew which way to steer us, and so we didn't get lost along the way. They put it together to show us a more direct route leading across to Connecticut. Some said we were in the wilderness and we were lost and we barely found our way. And others would say, oh, it was like a party going across, and it was just an easy day in the park. It was a long walk through woods where the natives had burned the underbrush, so you could see your way walking through the woods comfortably. And on our way, we passed the Indian villages, like at Wethersfield, where we saw their wigwams in the field in their villages. And it seemed strange to us coming across that people could live in a bark house, some of them 60 feet or more long, and have parents and grandparents and children all living there comfortably. They said they were quite comfortable even in the winter. It's hard to believe when we sit in our houses here and it's so cold. And we saw how rich the land was coming across in the fields that yielded corn in great abundance. And there were people in the party that said, let's stop here, let us settle here. But it was not to be, because the congregation needed to stay together to complete the journey. And we passed Indian places like Manchog. And we crossed the lake at Chowbungalog, and I shortened that. And we passed watering places along the way where the natives, the Indians, gathered to hunt and to fish. And we were able to trade for food along the way. So we didn't have to carry everything on our journey. But the fiercest part of the trip was crossing rivers. If you came at the wrong time, you could be swept away. Fortunately, our guides knew where to lead us to and what time. And in June, when we crossed the Quinnebog, the water was low, and we could walk easily across from one bank to the other. And if we slipped, there was someone there to catch us and help get across. And we also knew to stay up on the hills, because we saw if we were down in the valleys where the roads are now, the streams were greatly larger. If you only went a little way up the hill, a couple miles up in the hills, those streams and rivers were small and easily crossed. And some were easy to step across, and some we saw that there were stones placed in the brook for others to make their crossing easier. And beavers were everywhere. And the natives and the guides that we had would show us how they crossed. They'd run right across the dams. But we were a little more cautious and we'd walk across below them. In some places the dams caused ponds that were so great that we had to find a way through the woods in between the ponds. Very intelligent. And then, at the end of our 7th day on the trail, we came to a place that we call Pine Hill. And here there was a meadow where our cows could graze and there were streams nearby for water. And as we walked along the edge of the ridge, we were able to look out across the valley. And we could begin to see those final set of hills that we have to cross to reach the Connecticut. And so on that next day, the 8th day, we entered what had to be our darkest day, because we were tired from this long journey, 10 miles a day, and had to walk down through the valley and across more streams, up 2 or 3 more ranges of hills, and passing ponds and lakes on our way, to reach a point where we were worn out by the journey. And we began to lose hope that we would ever get out of these woods. But occasionally we'd get glimpses that would help to lift us along the way, and past meadows and streams. And if we weren't so tired, we might have thought it was a beautiful place. But our only thought was to get across. And so as we climbed over that last hill, we were told, now you're on the way to the Willimantic. And as we came down to the river, it occurred to us that we were almost home. So at the end of that 8th day, we were across. And on the 9th day, we knew we were almost home. And we had a climb to do along the path up to a place they called Hall Hill. And from there, we could look out into this wondrous valley that was Connecticut. And we knew we were home, truly, after crossing the ocean and hiking and walking all the way across those many miles from Cambridge. And so we made the safe arrival in Connecticut. I would have loved to have been in the back of the room when the stories were told about that crossing and that journey. We've kind of lost that ability to lend ourselves over to stories. And my rendering, I'm sure, is a poor attempt in comparison to the stories that were heard from Mary Hooker, and I suspect in all of those families were telling stories about their journeys. And their journey wasn't over. They went on to accomplish something that's extraordinary. Our motto here is in Connecticut, seed transplant still sustains. And we can understand from their view, it was like Moses leading them across, out of bondage, across the desert to the promised land. I'm sure somewhere in there in the sermons they worked that in as a comparison. But the towns of Windsor, Wethersfield, and Hartford were formed very close in that time, and they had close affiliation together. And in 1638, they came together, and you folks probably know the story a whole lot better than me, because I'm learning it, that Thomas Hooker was asked to be the first speaker at the gathering, where they began to consider how they would organize themselves as a colony. And his sermon built around the themes of the foundation of authorities, the free consent of the people. And this was an evolution, as you look back at what he was raising his issues back in England. It was an evolution. There was a next step leap in his thinking, that the people had the right to form government. And they had the right to remove the officials in government if they failed in their duties. And you think about where they came from and the storms that were building there and about to explode in the Civil War in England. That was carried here, and through much discussion among the freemen in the towns of Windsor, Wethersfield, and Hartford, the fundamental orders were ratified in January of 1639. So we're coming up on an anniversary next year, the 375th anniversary of something that they did that changed the shape of the world. That they created the first written constitution to create a government. And what was so different about this? We had other governments and other colonies. Those colonies came over with a charter with the king's granting of authority to form a government. These folks, these families coming down to Hartford and Windsor and Wethersfield, came together and formed a government of their own, without the king's authority. And I learned, it's a story I've learned, is that they voted in secret because in some level they knew how radical this was, and that the king might come back and order arrests of those who were defying his authority. So their action could be argued as really the start of the American Revolution back in 1639. Wondrous things that happened that this group brought about in their journey. And it was a journey, not just a physical journey, but we see that there were transformations in how they thought and what they believed in creating. Truly, in their minds, they were here to create a New England, because the old one no longer worked for them. So what happened to Mary Hooker's story? I'm going to try and wrap this up. Well, Mary and Roger had 8 children. And as I found, since I'm related to probably a whole bunch of other families, all those families tended to have a lot of children. And they had lots of children. And after a while, those children wound up coming over here towards Tolland and the other towns on the east side of Connecticut and settling, because there wasn't room over there. And other children, like my family, headed up towards the wilderness of Vermont. We have a family story of my ancestors going up to Connecticut in 1777 with their ox team in the dead of winter. They went literally along the river, because there wasn't a road. Had 16 children, planted a maple tree for each one, and those maple trees, some of them are still there around the house. Other children of theirs and these other families went west along up the Mohawk Valley to Ohio and on. I have relatives who went on to Iowa and Nebraska, down to Texas. They spread. And they kept telling stories, I'm sure, that their children kept asking, tell us a story. But the story kept getting updated. So Mary Hooker's story and those other stories of the people who first came, the stories became not of coming from England, but coming from Connecticut, or coming from New York, or Vermont, and going on to the prairie, and they carried those stories. But the central values of the stories still remained. A hope for a better life, a chance, an opportunity, and having the faith to risk. Because there was risk. They could lose. But having the faith to sustain them and carry them through it. So that story, I think, wound up, that story, I think, over time got woven together into a greater story that we call the story of America. And we think how powerful the story of America is, that it still calls people to America. There are people who still want to come for those very same things that brought people here to Connecticut all that long a while ago. Now, what happened to the path? Well, it was a footpath. And it evolved. As soon as settlement started here in Connecticut, there was a need for something better than a footpath. And the better ways for roads were not necessarily lined up with staying up there on top of the hills. And so we find even, there was a great long survey map, a 10-foot long map down at the Mass Archives that shows the route as of about 1795 with a survey, with all the taverns, and I wonder what these surveyors were thinking. They had all the taverns listed. I suppose that helps with the margin of error. But the routes shifted, and they shifted again. And over time, that path that might have been very good for walking to Connecticut wound up being bypassed and forgotten, except for those points where it remained in people's memories and family stories and the stories of towns. And today, well, there are some, and I came across this, that would say, there never really was a path and we can't be sure about it. Well, we know folks came from Cambridge down to here. And we have some ideas about how they might have come, but there could be some variations in how they got here. But we can say, as we come to a wrap on my portion here, we'll take a little break. So we're a secular nation, but we have places that are, really kind of sacred places to us in our heritage. And going back to, Plymouth Rock, how many of you really believe the Pilgrims pulled up to the beach in Plymouth, and they all made a point of getting out first step onto the rock. No, that probably didn't happen, but still the bus tours, and you know, we got to confess, we've all been there. It's part of our heritage. And you know, if you go on up to Lexington, hopefully you know now that the revolution didn't necessarily start there on the green in Lexington. But it's an important place in our national heritage. And where I'm going with this is taking you back just for a moment to Pine Hill. There are places up there in the hills that really are part of our heritage. And they're part of our story, this American story, that we can go back and you can seek them out and you can walk there. And if you really listen and use your imagination, thank God technology, they haven't figured out how to replace imagination. You can feel what they might have felt walking across that great wilderness. And to close on Pine Hill, I want to tell you that part of the story of Pine Hill is that Ellen Larned in her history and Charles Chisholm described, this was the place that in that oral tradition, the Hooker party camped on their journey across. There really is Pine Hill. And there was a story that Chisholm related about his farm, family farm was right there. And he said, there is a place on our farm that the path crosses that had never been plowed. That was recognized and passed down through generations as a special place. And this place here on Pine Hill, well, I have to tell you that it was, you go out and look in the woods and you're searching for something and you're just about to give up. It's like, enough, let's go home. And there it was. So if this is not one of the sacred places, it's one of many in our heritage. And in the towns across Connecticut and across Massachusetts, there are places that are hidden like this, that if you go to them and seek them out, they are part of your heritage and are worthy of preservation and recognition and give you a chance to step into another world. So I've done my part. I hope that I've done it well enough in reconnecting the Connecticut Path, sharing with you the pearl that you have here in town. And I think there's some talk about how to get others to be able to experience some of that, which we'll bring up a little later. And that story of the path. And the reason that I feel so strongly that I have to take time to share the story is places, so that was a pretty picture. But if you leave here tonight and somewhere along in your conversations you share the story, the path isn't going to be forgotten. It's going to be passed on to the next generation. And that's something that I think we all, as we look at how we can help preserve our heritage, and I'm so pleased that they're all here, and the Tolland Historical Society has made this possible, and Conserving Tolland, to help spread the word that there's heritage in the woods, there's something that helps to connect us with the past, that we can share and then pass on. Just a moment here, my friend Tim Gaudier is going to share with us some, I call it treasure hunting here in Tolland. Other places you may be able to find, and how you can join in and help him and others in doing this work. So, we've been a great audience, and again, I want to thank Roseanne and Barbara for wherever you are here in the room, that they helped to bring this about, and Conserving Tolland and the Tolland Historical Society, and most of all for all of you taking time to come here so I have people to share this with. For more information, Visit the Old Connecticut Path website